The year was 1881, late December, when the Wyoming plains lay buried under weeks of snow and cutting wind. The land had turned colorless gray skies, white ground and brown rock where the drifts hadn't swallowed it whole. Winters had grown crueler, or maybe that was just how Eli Granger felt them now. 36 worn thin by grief and silence. Once he had been a husband and a father. His wife Clara had died of fever. His little boy Noah just a few days later. That was 3 winters past. Since then, his life had shrunk to a rhythm of survival, keeping his cabin standing, feeding his horses, and waking up to another cold morning. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't ride into town. Towns meant people, and people meant questions. He stayed because there was nowhere else left to go, and silence was easier than answers. His cabin stood half a mile off the trail built from pine he'd cut himself. 1-room, low-ceiling plank bed rough table, 2 chairs, and a small stove that held the only warmth. It wasn't a home, just a shelter for a man too tired to care. His only mission now: survive the winter, keep the fire burning, keep the horses fed, and pray the loneliness didn't hollow him out completely. That night, the storm came down like a beast from the mountains. Wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling shutters and shaking the latch. Snow drove sideways across the window panes, finding its way through every crack, no matter how many times he sealed them. Eli sat at the table under the dim glow of a lantern sewing a torn leather strap. His rifle leaned against the wall, always within reach. The fire popped softly in the stove, the only sound inside. Then came a noise. He thought his mind had invented a faint thump against the door, almost hidden under the storm. He froze needle halfway through the leather. Another sound followed louder this time. A knock. Urgent. Real. No one came this far without reason, and reason in Eli's experience was rarely good. He took up the rifle, the wood worn smooth under his palm, and stepped toward the door. He listened. For a moment only the moan of the wind. Then 3 knocks again, uneven, weaker now. He unlatched the door and yanked it open, rifle angled low but ready. A figure stood there, half buried in snow. A woman. Her hair, long and black, clung to her face in frozen strands. Her skin was bronze, her lips cracked from cold, her dark eyes sharp and unbroken, even as her body shook. She wore a torn deerskin dress fringed with faint beadwork, stiff with frost and clinging to her frame. The neckline was ripped, exposing skin not from vanity, but from the brutal hand of the storm. Her voice came rough, rasped raw by wind. "Share my bed, or I die out here." For a heartbeat, Eli wanted to slam the door. He'd made his own rules long ago. No one else, no attachments, no reasons to hope. He'd promised himself he'd never be responsible for another life. But the way her shoulders trembled, the shallow rise of her breath, the raw red of her hands curling at her sides, he knew if he left her there, she wouldn't see morning. He lowered the rifle and stepped back without a word. She crossed the threshold quickly, as if afraid he might change his mind. The wave of heat from the stove hit her, and she gasped softly, closing her eyes in brief relief before turning to face him. Snow slipped from her hair onto the floorboards. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, her torn dress clinging damp against her body. Her eyes stayed locked on his wary, defiant. She looked like a woman who'd been told to beg, but chose instead to command. Eli shut the door, set the rifle aside, and studied her in the lantern's glow. She was young, no more than 24. Apache, he thought by her dress and bearing. Trouble if others were hunting her. But she was alone. He fetched a wool blanket from the bed and placed it near the stove. She sat slowly, drawing it over her shoulders, but never breaking her gaze. Eli ladled thin stew from the pot into a tin bowl and set it before her. She hesitated only a moment before lifting it with both hands and drinking. The storm raged outside, but inside that small cabin something else began, a fragile, wordless truce between a broken cowboy and the woman who refused to die. Her gaze softened a little, and Eli Granger noticed the tension leave her shoulders as the warmth began to seep into her bones. He leaned against the table, arms crossed, studying her in silence while she ate. His face stayed calm, but his mind raced beneath it. Who was this woman? Why had she come to his door in the heart of a blizzard? Was someone hunting her? He didn't have the answers, only the heavy sense that the storm had delivered her to him for a reason he couldn't yet name. The feeling in his chest wasn't fear. It was something he hadn't known in years. A faint spark of duty. The wind hammered harder outside, making the cabin creak and groan. Eli stoked the fire, adding another log, then turned and froze. The woman, still wrapped in the blanket, was now standing beside his bed. Without asking, she pulled the covers aside and slipped beneath them, her eyes on him, dark, unwavering, expectant. Eli stood still, breath tight. His thoughts tangled. He remembered Clara, his wife, lying in that very bed, her soft laughter the quiet nights before sickness took her. He remembered holding Noah, his boy, until the small body went still in his arms. His hand trembled against the back of the chair. Everything inside him screamed to keep the walls up, to stay untouched. But outside, the wind howled relentless, as if daring him to remain alone forever. The woman's face glowed faintly in the lantern light. Her body was drawn tight under the blanket, her eyes a strange mix of command and fear. At last, Eli moved slow, deliberate, his boots still on, as he sat on the edge of the bed. She shifted closer, her shoulder brushing his arm. Her warmth spread through him like fire through dry wood. Her breath was steady, quiet, real. Neither spoke. The storm filled the silence. The fire burned low, and Eli stared at the ceiling, every muscle rigid. He didn't know what this meant, only that she was alive because he'd opened that door. That truth, at least, was enough for tonight. For the first time in 3 winters, his cabin wasn't empty. The storm raged until dawn, clawing at the roof beams and shaking the shutters. Snow hissed through the cracks, the wind a living thing. Inside, the air grew thick and heavy from the stove's heat. The faint scent of smoke mingled with the damp musk of her drying clothes. Eli lay stiff on one side of the bed, boots still on his back, half turned toward her. He could feel her warmth pressing through the thin layers of cloth and wool. Every time she shifted, his muscles tensed. His mind circled back to memories he'd buried. This bed once belonged to another life, another love before death took it all. He tried to hold himself still, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, but his heart betrayed him. She was close enough that her breath touched his shoulder, slow and real. It had been years since another human being had rested beside him. Part of him wanted to pull away to rebuild the wall of solitude that had kept him alive. But another part, quieter yet stubborn, told him to stay. She had come to his door, half dead. If he'd turned her away, she would already be a ghost beneath the snow. That simple fact chained him there beside her. The night dragged on long and restless. Neither spoke. He noticed things he wished he hadn't, her hair half dry and scattered across the blanket, her shoulders shivering from time to time, the torn fabric across her chest that gave no protection. He forced his gaze away, ashamed of the thoughts that crept in, though he was only a man fighting to keep control. Sleep came in broken fragments. By morning, the storm had calmed, leaving the world buried deep in white silence. The quiet after the wind felt almost holy, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Eli rose first, pulling on his coat, lighting another lamp and feeding wood into the stove. He glanced toward the bed. She was awake, her dark eyes watching him with a cautious steadiness. Color had returned to her face, and her lips no longer cracked with cold. She sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. "I need to know your name," Eli said at last, his voice low but steady. She hesitated as if measuring whether to trust him. "Asha," she said finally. "Asha Redfeather." The name carried strength even through her hoarse voice. Eli nodded once. "You come from a tribe nearby?" he asked. She shook her head. "No. My people scattered. Some are dead, others taken." She looked down, gripping the edge of the blanket tighter. "I walked for many days. Men followed. I lost them in the storm." That answered everything he'd wondered through the night, why she carried herself like someone born to survive, why she'd come to his door alone. She hadn't just wandered. She'd been running for her life. Eli poured coffee into 2 tin cups and slid one toward her. She reached out slowly, eyes never leaving his, as though still uncertain if he might take it back. He didn't. She lifted it to her lips, wincing at the heat, but drinking anyway. For the first time in years, Eli realized the silence in his cabin wasn't the silence of death. It was the beginning of something alive. Her eyes never left his, still uncertain if he might pull the cup away. He didn't. She drank, wincing at the heat, then exhaled softly as her shoulders relaxed. "You can stay until the storm passes," Eli Granger said at last, his voice quiet but firm. The words felt heavier than he meant them to. Letting someone into his cabin meant breaking the rhythm that had kept him alive through 3 long winters. It meant facing the questions he'd buried deep, the ones that asked whether his heart was still capable of caring for anyone at all. Asha Redfeather studied him with those steady dark eyes. "I'll stay until I can walk without freezing," she replied. No plea, no gratitude. Just fact. Eli felt something stir at her tone. Stubbornness. Will. The kind of survival he understood. He respected it, even if it unsettled him. He lifted the pot from the stove, poured another bowl of stew, and placed it before her. This time she ate slower, calmer. While she did, Eli noticed how thin her deerskin dress really was torn at the seams, too fragile for a Wyoming winter. If she stepped outside dressed like that, she wouldn't last an hour. He crossed the room to a small chest, pulled out a thick wool shirt, too big for her, and set it on the table. "You'll need this." Her gaze flicked to the shirt, then back to him. Pride and need fought quietly in her eyes. After a moment, she reached for it. Her fingers traced the rough fabric as if the simple act cost her something. She didn't put it on right away, but he saw the way her grip tightened like it meant more than warmth. The day passed mostly in silence, broken only by the dull rhythm of work. Eli shoveled snow from the door, checked the horses in the lean-to, and split wood until his arms ached. Each time he stepped back inside, she was there by the fire, sometimes watching him, sometimes lost in the flames, her thoughts far away. He wondered what kind of pain had carved that distance into her eyes. But he didn't ask. Some things were too heavy for words, and silence was a weight he understood. By evening, the wind had quieted enough to hear the trees creak beyond the cabin walls. Eli sat at the table cleaning his rifle. Across the room, Asha rose from her place near the stove, the blanket still around her shoulders. Without a word, she reached for the shirt he'd given her earlier. She slipped it over her torn dress, the fabric loose on her frame, but it covered her bare shoulders at last. Then she sat down across from him, her hands resting on the table. "You've lost someone, too," she said softly. Eli's hands stopped moving. His jaw tightened, his breath caught. For a heartbeat, anger flickered in him, not at her, but at the wound she'd unknowingly touched. He saw Clara's fevered face. He felt Noah's small, still hand. He hadn't spoken of them to another soul since the day they died. He forced his jaw to unclench. "Yes," he said at last. "Nothing more." Asha didn't press. She only nodded, eyes understanding more than words could say. The fire burned low, and the night wrapped around them again. This time, when they lay in bed, Eli took off his boots. He lay back slowly, feeling her shift closer. He didn't touch her, not yet, but her warmth filled the hollow that had lived inside him too long. He stared at the ceiling beams, listening to the quiet. Something had changed. The cabin was no longer just a shell for one man's survival. It breathed again. Morning came, pale and weak sunlight filtered through heavy clouds, washing the snow in a faint silver glow. The drifts reached higher than a man's waist. Travel was impossible for days. Eli stood by the window, breath fogging the glass, measuring the work ahead, keeping the horses alive. The stove fed the roof clear. Behind him came the sound of blankets shifting. Asha sat up, her dark hair falling over the wool shirt he'd given her. She looked stronger than the night before, though her eyes still held that sharp alertness, like a wild creature, always ready to run. Eli felt the weight settle deeper on his chest. It wasn't just his life he had to keep breathing anymore. She had said men were following her. The storm wouldn't stop them forever. He turned from the window, pulling on his coat, feeding wood into the stove. "You'll tell me the rest," he said, his tone calm but steady. Asha held his gaze for a moment before lowering her eyes. "They were traitors," she said quietly. "Men who buy and sell." Asha Redfeather said quietly. "They wanted me as part of their trade. I ran the first chance I had." Her fingers clenched tightly in her lap. "If they find me, they won't stop." The air in the cabin thickened. Eli Granger had heard stories like hers before, terrible ones whispered around campfires or over a glass of whiskey in town, but hearing it from her own lips made his stomach twist. He felt anger stir slow and deep, though his face stayed still as stone. He knew exactly what kind of men those were. And he knew that if they were tracking her, they wouldn't forget or forgive the escape. If they reached his cabin, it wouldn't just be her life on the line. Still, Eli shoved the thought away. He couldn't send her back out into that frozen hell. Whatever came, the choice had already been made the moment he'd opened his door to her. At dawn, he made breakfast, thick cornbread from the skillet and the last of the stew. They ate without words, but the silence between them was no longer hollow. It carried something fragile, understanding, maybe even respect. Asha ate slowly, her sharp eyes drifting around the cabin as if committing every detail to memory. She looked less guarded than before, though her posture remained straight, alert, ready for danger that might never come. When the meal was done, Eli turned to his chores. The snow piled so high he had to shovel just to open the door. The horses needed water melted from buckets of snow. He worked with the steady rhythm he'd built his life around, but now he found himself glancing back toward the cabin more than once, half expecting to find it empty. Each time he returned, she was still there, small, calm, focused. Once he came in to see her sitting near the fire, holding a needle and thread he'd left on the table. She was mending the torn sleeve of his old shirt, stitching with quiet care, her brow furrowed in concentration. He stopped dead in his tracks. No one had touched his clothes since Clara. The sight hit him harder than he wanted to admit. He stood there longer than he should have, saying nothing, just watching her. Asha felt his gaze paused, then looked up and handed the shirt to him with a small nod. "Better now," she said simply. Eli took it without a word. His throat tightened, but he swallowed the ache. He wanted to ask her questions about her family, where she came from, what she would do once the thaw came, but he didn't. She was here alive, and that was enough for now. Evening came, and the storm outside had faded to a whisper. The fire painted the cabin in warm light, throwing flickers across her face as she sat near the stove. Eli sat at the table, his hands heavy on the wood, his mind turning in slow circles. He knew what people would say if they saw her here. In the nearby towns, hatred toward the Apache ran deep and cruel. If he brought her there, she'd face danger all over again. Out here she had safety, but it meant tying his fate to hers. The silence broke when she spoke softly. "You never asked why I knocked." Eli looked up, caught off guard. "I chose this door," she said. "Not just because of the storm. I saw smoke. I thought maybe the man inside still had a heart." Her eyes met his, unwavering. "If I was wrong, I would have died on your doorstep." Her words hit harder than a bullet. For 3 winters, Eli had built his life on silence, no one to depend on, no one to need him. Yet now, sitting across from this woman who'd spoken without fear, he felt the walls he'd built begin to crack. He said nothing, but his jaw set, and his hands tightened around the table's edge. That night, when they lay in bed again, the quiet between them was heavier, yet not empty. Asha moved closer without hesitation, her hand brushing his arm lightly. Eli stiffened at first, but then let the tension go. Her heartbeat pressed against him, steady and real. For the first time in years, he didn't lie awake, haunted by memories of loss. Instead, he listened to the sound of another soul breathing beside him. He closed his eyes, knowing tomorrow would bring the questions they couldn't avoid about the men hunting her and about what her staying really meant. But for that night, survival was enough. They were both alive, and neither of them faced the storm alone. The days after the blizzard moved slower with a new rhythm neither of them spoke about. Eli no longer moved only for himself. Every time he chopped wood, hauled water, or checked the horses, his mind drifted back to the woman sitting by his fire. Asha grew stronger. Her color returned. Her voice no longer cracked. Her eyes were alert again. She moved through the cabin with quiet purpose, mending seams, sweeping with a bundled branch, portioning out food carefully, like someone who understood scarcity. Eli noticed she ate less than she should, saving more for him, though he never mentioned it. For 3 winters, his cabin had been a tomb of silence. Now it breathed. 2 sets of footsteps. 2 bodies sharing warmth under one blanket. 2 pairs of eyes meeting in the glow of the fire. He told himself it was only temporary, that once the snow melted and the trails cleared, she would move on. But deep down, he wasn't sure if he wanted her to. When Eli Granger caught Asha Redfeather's gaze lingering on the rough cabin walls on the way, the firelight danced across the worn wood. A thought slipped into his mind, one he hadn't dared entertain before. Maybe she wasn't thinking about leaving. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to picture herself staying longer than either of them would admit aloud. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer sharp and defensive. It carried a strange calm, an unspoken rhythm that seemed to settle into the room. When she brushed past him near the stove, when her fingers grazed his hand as she reached for a cup, when her hair slipped loose and caught the glow of the fire, each moment caught him off guard, like the ghost of something he thought he'd buried with Clara. He tried not to stare at the curve of her chest beneath the wool shirt he'd given her, but his eyes betrayed him more than once. Shame wrestled with the quiet ache of feeling alive again. It had been so long since warmth, real human warmth, had found its way into his life, he almost didn't know how to hold it. 2 nights later, as the storm settled into silence and the fire burned low, Eli finally asked the question that had been clawing at him ever since she mentioned the men hunting her. "They'll keep looking," he said. "How close do you think they are?" Asha's dark eyes flicked toward the door, then back to him. "Not far," she said softly. "They had horses. Men like that don't give up easy." She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "If they find me here, they'll take me. And you too, if you stand in their way." The old instinct rose in him, cut ties close the door, let the storm take what it wanted before it took him down too. But that door had already been opened once, and he couldn't make himself shut it again. The thought of sending her back into the cold now felt like a betrayal of everything he'd once believed about right and wrong. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then we'll be ready," he said. Asha studied him carefully, her gaze searching. "Why?" You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Eli's jaw tightened. The words scraped out low, raw. "I owed my wife and son, and I couldn't keep them. I won't turn another soul out to die, not while I'm still breathing." The room went still. Asha lowered her eyes, her shoulders softening. Then slowly she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The touch was brief, but it carried the weight of trust. He didn't pull away. The next morning, Eli went to check on the horses. That's when he saw them hoof prints along the tree line. One horse, maybe two. Not close, but close enough to tighten the air in his chest. When he stepped back inside, his face told the story before his words did. "They found the valley," he said quietly. Asha's grip tightened around the tin cup in her hands. "Then it's only a matter of time." Eli nodded, already moving through the motions. He checked his rifle, laid out the few cartridges he had left. He hadn't fired a shot in nearly a year, but the feel of the weapon was as familiar as his own heartbeat. Asha said nothing, but he saw her breathing quicken, the knowledge settling in that the past she'd tried to outrun was coming straight for them. That night, unease hung heavy in the cabin. When they lay down, Eli expected her to keep her distance. Instead, she moved closer, pressing against his side, her head resting against his chest. His body tensed at first, then relaxed as his arms found their way around her, slow and hesitant. Her heart beat steady against his ribs. In the silence, he realized something that both frightened and grounded him. She had already become part of his life in ways he hadn't planned. The cabin was no longer just his, and soon others would come to test what it meant to let her stay. But as her breath evened out against him, Eli made a decision. He didn't speak aloud. Whatever came down that trail, he would not hand her over. Morning came cold and brutal, the kind of cold that burned the lungs before breath could escape. Eli opened the door just enough to look out. The world lay white and still, but the tracks he'd seen yesterday hadn't vanished. They'd only half filled with snow. Signs of horses. Not his. He stood there for a long time, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line, every sense stretched thin. When he finally closed the door, Asha was already watching him from the stove, her blanket wrapped tight, eyes sharp and knowing. "They're close," he said flatly. Her gaze fell, her jaw tightening. "They won't stop. They think I belong to them." The words hit harder than he expected. Eli sat at the table, resting the rifle against the chair. For 3 winters he had sworn never to carry the burden of another life. But here she was standing in his cabin, defiant, even in fear, the same way she had been the night she demanded to be let in. She hadn't begged once since that night. She'd simply refused to break. And that quiet strength stirred something in him, respect, admiration, maybe something deeper he couldn't yet name. After a long silence, Eli looked up. His voice low but firm. "If they come here," he said, "this won't be an easy place for them to take. I know this land." Asha Redfeather said, her voice steady but low. "I've held men off before." She studied Eli Granger's face for a long moment. "Why risk it? You don't know me. You don't even know what I've done." Eli's jaw tightened. He looked her straight in the eyes. "I don't need to know. You came to my door, that makes it my fight now." For the first time since he'd met her, Asha's shoulders softened. Her gaze fell as if she couldn't bear the weight of his words. She turned to the pot on the stove, ladling stew, though neither of them had the appetite to eat. The rest of the day carried a quiet heaviness. Eli worked outside, clearing snow from the roof, checking the horses, his eyes constantly sweeping the tree line. Asha came out once, wrapped in his wool shirt and a blanket, standing near the corral in silence. He watched her trace the horizon with her eyes, memorizing every ridge and hollow, the paths men might take if they came. When Eli noticed her staring too long toward the woods, he walked over. "You've seen them track before," he said. She nodded. "They're not many, but they know how to follow. Men like Jed Crow don't fear storms when they smell profit ahead." She clutched the blanket tighter. "They'll wait for darkness. That's when they like to strike." Eli filed that away. She knew these men, their ways, their patience. She wasn't some helpless soul dropped on his doorstep. She was a survivor, battle-hardened by the life she'd escaped. He respected that more than anything. When night fell, they shared the bed again. The fire burned low, throwing long shadows against the cabin walls. Asha shifted closer, her head resting against his shoulder. Her hand brushed lightly across his chest, staying there longer than before. Eli froze, then slowly let the tension leave his body. It had been years since a woman's touch had crossed his life, and it shook him more than the danger outside. He turned slightly, meeting her gaze in the flicker of firelight. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. Her nearness said it all. She trusted him. With her body, her safety, and her fear. Sleep came late. Sometime after midnight, the horses snorted nervously in the lean-to. Eli's eyes snapped open, every muscle tightened. He rose, quietly, pulled on his coat and took his rifle from beside the bed. Asha was already awake, silent but alert. Her eyes locked on the door. They both knew what that sound meant. Eli opened the door just enough to step outside. The cold bit into him like a blade, but he ignored it, scanning the ridge. Shadows moved along the tree line, 3 men on horseback, keeping their distance, watching. One raised an arm, pointing toward the cabin. Eli's grip tightened around the rifle. He backed inside and closed the door. "They found us," he said flatly. Asha's breath hitched, but there was no fear in her eyes, only steel. "They'll come at dawn," she said quietly. Eli nodded. He sat at the table, rifle laid across his knees, staring into the fire. For years he had lived for no one but himself. No ties, no words, no warmth. But now, with her sitting across from him, he understood something with startling clarity. He wasn't alone anymore. This fight wasn't just about survival. It was about protecting her. They waited side by side, the fire burning low. The silence broken only by the creak of wood under the weight of wind and snow. Dawn came slow and gray light bleeding through the clouds without warmth. The cabin walls groaned with the cold. Eli hadn't slept a minute. He sat near the door, rifle ready, body coiled tight. 3 men out there, maybe more, waiting for their moment. Asha hadn't slept either. She sat near the stove, the blanket draped around her shoulders, her dark eyes steady on him. She didn't ask what he planned. She just watched and waited. Her quiet trust said more than words ever could. Eli felt the weight of it settle deep in his chest. For the first time in 3 winters, someone was counting on him. Questions he'd tried to avoid pressed against his mind. Who were these men really? What did they want with her beyond what she'd told him? Why had she been alone when she found his door? As if hearing his thoughts, Asha spoke, her voice soft but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "They took others from my people," she said. "Women. Children. Anyone they could sell. Asha." Redfeather said, her voice flat but trembling beneath the surface. "Some they handed over to the towns for work. Others?" She stopped, jaw tightening. "Others were traded for liquor and rifles. I ran before they could take me too, but they still think I belong to them." Eli Granger's jaw clenched, eyes narrowing to hard steel. He had known men like that, men who treated human lives like cattle bought and sold at the edge of the frontier. He'd seen their kind in dusty border towns, wearing polite smiles and carrying bloody hands. The memory always brought the same mix of anger and shame, the kind that burned slow and deep. But now that anger had teeth, they were coming for her and they were close. By mid-morning, the faint sound of horses reached through the wind. Eli rose slowly and peered through a crack in the shutter. 3 riders had dismounted at the far edge of the clearing. They moved deliberately, scanning the cabin and corral, rifles slung across their backs, pistols on their hips, faces half covered with scarves. One of them pointed toward the chimney smoke. They knew someone was inside. Eli stepped back from the window, mind racing. The cabin gave him cover, thick pine walls, 1 rifle and a revolver with a handful of cartridges. He'd faced worse odds before, but never with another life depending on his own. He turned toward Asha. "They'll try to draw me out," he said evenly. "If I go down, you take the back door and run for the ridge. Don't look back." She stood fast, the blanket sliding from her shoulders. "No, I won't leave." Eli frowned. "You don't understand what they'll do if they catch you." "I do," she snapped. "That's exactly why I won't run. If they take you, they'll take me anyway." "I stay." He felt frustration rise, sharp and helpless, but then he saw it in her eyes. It wasn't recklessness. It was resolve, the same will that had carried her across miles of snow to his door, the same strength that kept her alive when others had fallen. He gave a curt nod. "Then stay low. Don't stand near the windows." A voice rang out from beyond the door, rough, commanding, muffled by the storm. "Man inside. Send the girl out, and we'll let you live." Eli's grip tightened on the rifle. He said nothing. He crouched by the window, sighted down the barrel, and fired a warning shot. The bullet struck the snow inches from one rider's boots, throwing up a burst of white powder. The men shouted, scattering for cover. Their answer came quick gunfire, cracking through the air, slamming into the cabin walls. Splinters flew from the doorframe, peppering the floor. Asha ducked near the stove hands over her head, but her eyes stayed sharp, watching his every move. Eli crouched low, moving from one shutter to the next, firing with precision, measured, controlled bursts meant to keep them pinned down. He wasn't trying to kill them yet, just to remind them this wasn't going to be easy. But as the minutes dragged and the gunfire grew heavier, he knew blood would come before the end. One of the men broke from cover, sprinting toward the stable. Eli saw him move and fired. The man dropped hard into the snow, his rifle spinning from his grasp. The other 2 shouted voices, raw with anger. More bullets slammed into the cabin, one striking a lantern on the shelf. Glass shattered. Oil splashed across the floor, flames threatening to leap. Asha lunged forward without hesitation, grabbing a blanket and smothering the spill before it could ignite. Eli caught the moment out of the corner of his eye, a sharp breath leaving his chest. She wasn't a burden. She was fighting beside him. The gunfire slowed. Then came another shout from outside. "You can't hold us off forever, Cowboy. Give her up and maybe we'll let you live." Eli's voice came back low and hard, the sound of a man who'd already buried too much. "She's not yours. You want her, you'll have to die for it." Silence. Then the crunch of boots in the snow. They were circling. Eli reloaded quickly, his hands steady from habit, every motion clean and practiced. He slid the revolver across the table to Asha. She looked down at it, then up at him. Her hand didn't shake. "I can shoot," she said. He held her gaze a moment, then nodded once. "Then watch the back. Don't waste a bullet, unless you mean it." Asha moved toward the rear window, crouching low. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the smell of smoke and gunpowder. Inside, 2 souls prepared to fight not just for their lives, but for the fragile bond that had made them more than strangers in a storm. The next assault came harder. One man broke from cover, firing wild as he charged. Eli Granger dropped to one knee, sighted through the narrow shutter crack, and squeezed the trigger. The man pitched forward into the snow, a burst of white powder rising around his body. Before Eli could turn, another muzzle flash burst from the opposite side of the cabin, but a sharp crack rang out behind him first. Asha Redfeather stood at the rear window, revolver smoking in her hand, her eyes fierce and unblinking. Outside, the second attacker stumbled back, clutching his arm, howling before disappearing into the trees. For a long heartbeat, silence filled the cabin. Eli turned toward her, breath ragged, and their eyes locked, two souls who had no reason to trust anyone, now bound by something neither could name. The quiet cowboy who had built walls around his heart, and the Apache woman who had stepped into his solitude carrying fire in her blood. She had stood her ground not as a frightened fugitive, but as a fighter. Outside, the last man shouted something guttural, swung into his saddle, and vanished into the tree line. The only sounds that remained were the hiss of wind through the eaves and the heavy thud of Eli's heartbeat. He lowered the rifle slowly, shoulders slumping under the weight of what had just unfolded. Smoke hung thick inside the broken lantern, still smoldering near the floor. Asha placed the revolver down carefully, her chest rising fast, every breath visible in the cold air. Eli crossed the room, his rough hands trembling slightly as he touched her arm. She looked up at him, those sharp eyes now softer, carrying something neither of them had allowed themselves in years. "You stayed," he said quietly. "I told you I would," she replied, her voice steady as stone. For the first time in 3 winters, Eli felt the wall around him give way. They had survived not because he'd saved her, but because they had fought side by side. When the fire was rebuilt and silence crept back into the cabin, Eli knew one truth with certainty: those men would return. But he also knew he would never again face the cold alone. The clearing outside was still, but not peaceful. The snow was scarred with blood and bodies, one near the corral, another crawling toward the trees, leaving a dark trail behind him. The third was gone, but Eli knew he'd be back. Men like Jed Crow's breed didn't forget. They gathered more and came harder. He stepped outside into the brittle morning air, boots crunching on frozen ground. The first man lay motionless, frost already forming along his collar. Eli looked at him without pity, just quiet certainty. Violence had followed him once before. It had found him again. His pale eyes swept the ridges before turning back toward the cabin. Inside, Asha knelt beside the fire, feeding new wood into the flames. The glow painted her face in gold and shadow. Her revolver rested beside her on the floor, silent now, but still within reach. Her hands moved steadily, but her breath came quick, as though her body hadn't yet convinced itself the danger had passed. When Eli stepped through the door, she lifted her head, meeting his gaze. There was no fear in her eyes, only calm determination. "They'll come again," she said simply. Eli set his rifle against the wall, pulling off his gloves. "Yeah," he murmured. "They will." He sat at the table, rubbing his hands across his face. The weight of it all pressed heavy on him, the gunfire, the blood, the way she had stood beside him without hesitation. "You held your ground," he said after a pause. "You didn't have to." Asha's jaw set firm. "If I run every time, I'm nothing but prey. I won't be prey." The words struck deep. Eli's mind flicked to Clara, to Noah, to those nights when helplessness had broken him apart. Watching Asha fire that revolver, steady, unflinching, stirred something inside him he hadn't felt since before the sickness took everything. He didn't see weakness in her. He saw fight, and it made him want to fight too. The cabin bore scars of the battle. A bullet hole splintered the window frame, another lodged deep in the table leg. Dark oil stains marked the floor where the lantern had shattered. Eli began the repairs at first light, patching wood with what little he had. Asha worked beside him, melting snow for water, scrubbing soot from the floor, draping blankets to block the drafts. They moved mostly in silence, but there was rhythm in it now. Two people adjusting to life, not as strangers, but as survivors bound by circumstance and something quieter unspoken. As night settled again, they sat close by the fire, sharing the last of the stew. The flames crackled low shadows dancing on their faces. Eli finally broke the silence. "Was there no one left with you?" "No family." Asha's hand froze over the bowl. She stared into the fire, her voice low when she finally spoke. "My father was killed when the soldiers came. My mother died of sickness. I had one brother." Asha's voice didn't falter, but her eyes dimmed like dying embers. "They traded him south 2 winters ago," she said quietly. "I am the last." The words hit Eli Granger like a hammer. He knew grief, but hers cut deeper. Her family gone, her people scattered to the winds, her life narrowed down to survival in the hands of men like Jed Crow. He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the rough-hewn beams above, feeling that familiar tightening in his chest, the one he'd carried since Clara and Noah were taken from him. He had told himself there was nothing left worth protecting, but now across from him sat a woman who had lost everything and still refused to break. He reached across the table, his hand rough and scarred, and laid it over hers. She stiffened, then slowly let it stay. They sat like that for a long while, firelight flickering against the cabin walls, shadows swaying around them like ghosts of lives long gone. When she finally lifted her gaze to meet his, there was something new in her eyes, neither defiance nor fear, but a quiet yearning, a need for connection. That night when they lay down, Asha shifted closer again, but this time her hand didn't stop at his arm. Her palm pressed against his chest, her eyes holding his, waiting. Eli's breath slowed, heart pounding beneath her touch. He had sworn never to open his heart again, never to feel this kind of closeness. Yet something inside him cracked, and through it, warmth slipped in. He leaned down, hesitated only a moment, then brushed his lips gently against hers. The kiss wasn't wild, it was slow, deliberate, cautious. 2 wounded souls afraid to want too much, yet desperate for something real. It carried the weight of years, his silence, her struggle, meeting in a single fragile moment. When they finally parted, she rested her forehead against his, her breath warm against his cheek. "You didn't turn me out," she whispered. "I won't," Eli murmured back, voice raw. They lay in silence, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the kind shared by 2 people who had decided, if only for tonight, to stop running. The next morning, Eli made his choice known through his hands. He dug a trench by the corral, boarded up the windows, stacked firewood high by the door. Asha worked beside him, hauling snow-breaking branches, fetching water. She no longer moved like a guest. She moved like she belonged there. By nightfall, the cabin felt changed. The scars of the fight still marked its walls, but the air carried something new strength unity. Eli sat near the fire watching Asha mend the sleeve of his coat, where a bullet had torn it. Her fingers moved deftly, her hair falling across her cheek, the firelight warming her skin. For the first time in years, Eli felt something stir deep inside hope. Yet behind that hope lay the shadow of truth. The danger wasn't over. The men wouldn't forgive the dead. They'd come again, and next time they'd come harder. Still, when Asha looked up and their eyes met, he knew one thing with certainty: they would face it together. The cabin no longer belonged only to Eli Granger, the man who'd lived 3 winters in silence. It now carried the pulse of 2 lives intertwined. Her presence was everywhere, his wool shirt folded neatly after she wore it, her needle and thread always within reach, the blanket spread across the floor where she worked by the fire. For years he'd walked past those small things without thought, but now he saw them. He saw her. And though the quiet returned, it wasn't the same quiet. Danger still hung heavy, 2 men dead. One escaped a message sure to spread. More would follow, men drawn by greed, vengeance, or the promise of trade. Eli felt it sharpening him. He checked the rifle more often, kept the revolver at his side, moved with the alertness of a man who knew the next dawn might bring blood. Asha, sensing his unease, mirrored it. She didn't deny the threat, but she didn't shrink from it either. That morning he found her standing by the corral, wrapped in his coat, her dark hair loose over her shoulders. The snow bit at her bare feet, yet she stood steady, scanning the ridgeline like a hawk. "You watch like someone who's hunted," Eli said quietly as he approached. She turned, her expression unreadable. "I am hunted," she said. Then, after a pause that lingered in the cold air, added, "And now so are you." Eli followed her gaze toward the tree line where the shadows of the forest stretched long and dark. Because he had chosen to stand with her, the world had chosen to stand against them. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes told her everything. Asha Redfeather was right. Eli Granger's choice had already been made the moment he opened his door to her. Later that day, while they worked side by side splitting logs, Asha finally asked the question she had held back. "Why do you live out here alone?" Eli's hands froze on the axe handle. Memories rose unbidden, the fever that had taken Clara, the small mound of frozen earth where Noah rested beneath the pines. His throat tightened before he managed to say, "I had a family once. Lost them. After that, silence was all I had left." Asha studied him for a long while, her dark eyes softer than he'd ever seen. "Silence keeps you alive," she said quietly. "But it doesn't keep you whole." Her words struck deep. Eli wanted to argue, but he couldn't. She had lost just as much, maybe more, and yet she still carried a spark he thought long dead. In her, he saw the strength he had buried under years of grief. That night, when they lay together again, the distance between them dissolved completely. Asha leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her hand, resting at her side. When she tilted her face toward his, he kissed her deeper this time, the kind of kiss that pulled years of silence and sorrow out of him like a confession. They lingered there, breathing each other's warmth, the firelight flickering across their faces. When she finally rested her forehead against his chest, her voice was quiet, but resolute. "You didn't turn me out," she whispered. "That makes you mine now, whether you wanted it or not." Eli let out a low, rough laugh. "Then I'm yours," he said. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. Near dawn, the horses spooked again, their cries sharp and fearful. Eli rose, fast boots thudding against the floor, rifle in hand. Asha followed close behind as he stepped into the freezing air. Dark shapes moved on the ridge, 6, maybe 7 riders this time. More than before. All armed. They brought more. Asha murmured, her fingers clutching his arm. Eli's jaw set like stone. He knew the cabin couldn't hold if they pressed hard. They would need more than walls, they'd need will. "If it comes to it," he said firmly, "we fight together. No running, no surrender." Her eyes burned like firelight. "I already told you," she said. "I stay." The riders didn't charge. They lingered at the ridge, watching, waiting, testing nerves before the strike. Eli recognized the tactic. He led Asha back inside and bolted the door. He checked his rifle, laid out the cartridges, and handed her the revolver once more. Their eyes met in the lamplight. No words, only understanding. Hours crawled by. Snow fell thick, swallowing sound. Every creak of timber and sigh of wind felt like the moment before gunfire. Asha sat across from him at the table, revolver near her hand, her gaze steady and unflinching. He wondered if she was afraid, if she regretted ever knocking on his door, but the answer was clear in her eyes. There was no regret, no fear, only resolve. She had decided long ago that she'd rather die fighting than be taken again. By nightfall, the figures on the ridge began to move. Eli glimpsed them through the shutters, shadows weaving among the trees, preparing. He turned to Asha. "They'll come at dawn," he said. Her reply was quiet but fierce. "Then tomorrow," she said, "we kill them." The fire burned low. The wind hushed outside. For the first time in years, Eli felt something stronger than fear. Before a fight, the steady calm of a man who no longer stood alone. When dawn broke gray and heavy with snow, he took his place at the window rifle steady. 6 men waited along the tree line, rifles slung, horses stamping in the cold. They hadn't come to threaten. They'd come to finish it. Inside, the fire crackled. Asha sat beside the stove, revolver in her lap, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She didn't look frightened. She looked ready. And in that moment, Eli finally understood what he hadn't dared to admit that first night when she came to his door. She hadn't just been seeking refuge. She had been choosing him, and he had chosen her right back. "They'll hit harder this time," Eli Granger said quietly, eyes fixed on the snow-veiled ridge beyond the window. "Asha." Redfeather's gaze lifted to meet his steady fierce. "Then we hit harder," she answered. For a while, the only sound was the soft pop and crackle of the fire. Anyone who might have listened to their story would have wondered what Eli now asked himself. Was he really willing to risk his life? His home? Everything he'd built for a woman he'd only known a handful of days? The answer sat heavy in his chest, as sure and solid as the rifle gripped in his hands, yes. Because since the moment she stepped through his door, the silence that had haunted him for years had finally been broken, and he would not go back to that hollow quiet. The first gunshots came sudden and savage, slamming into the cabin walls, splinters flying across the floorboards. Eli dropped to one knee, fired through the shutter, and watched a rider spin from his saddle, crashing into the snow. The others shouted, their voices sharp in the frozen air. Asha crawled toward the back window, the revolver steady in her grasp. When a dark shape flickered between the pines, she fired. The man stumbled back, clutching his side, his rifle dropping from his hand. Gunfire tore through the clearing, smoke filling the cabin. Eli moved from one window to the next, firing measured, disciplined shots, never wasting a round. The men outside cursed and barked orders, trying to flank him, but he knew the rhythm of a fight like this. It was all sound, aim, and heartbeat. Only this time it wasn't his life alone he was fighting for. 2 men broke from cover, making for the corral. Eli swung the shutter open and fired twice. One dropped, the other scrambled back to the trees. Return fire hammered the wall, a bullet grazing his cheek, hot and sharp. He ducked, reloading fast, the motions burned into him from the old days. Beside him, Asha rose from the floor, eyes blazing like a storm. She snatched up the spare cartridges from the table and handed them to him without hesitation. "Don't stop," she said firmly. "Keep pressing, they'll break." Her voice steady, sure cut through the chaos. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't pleading. She was standing with him, fierce as the wind outside. Eli slammed the chamber shut, raised his rifle, and fired again. Another man fell. The shouting outside turned to panic, fear breaking through their anger. 3 dead, 1 wounded. The remaining men fired a desperate volley. Then Eli heard the retreat boots pounding horses, snorting saddles creaking as they fled into the timber. The clearing fell silent, save for the hiss of the wind and Eli's ragged breathing. He held his aim through the shutter until the last rider vanished into the dark. Only then did he lower the rifle. His chest heaved, his arms burned, but his eyes stayed sharp, waiting. No sound came except the faint moan of the storm. When he turned, Asha was still holding the revolver, her shoulders trembling, her breath uneven. Their eyes met. For the first time since the fight began, She exhaled a long, shaky breath that sounded like release. Eli crossed to her, set his rifle aside, and placed his rough hand gently over hers, easing the revolver down onto the table. They stood there for a long moment, the silent cowboy who had walled off his heart, and the woman who had walked into his life with nothing but defiance and will. "It's over," Eli said at last, his voice low but certain. Asha searched his face. "They won't come again." Her tone carried more hope than fear. "They lost too many," he answered. "Men like that don't chase what they can't take." He paused, jaw tight. "And even if they try, they'll find us waiting." "Find." The words settled in her like warmth after cold. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his chest, her body trembling now that the danger had passed. He lowered his forehead to hers, their breath mingling in the still air. Her whisper was soft, almost lost beneath the crackling fire. "Then I stay, if you'll have me." Eli's throat tightened. 3 winters alone, 3 winters of grief and ghosts, and now the choice came easy. "Stay," he said firmly. "This is your home now, same as mine." Her eyes softened, and when their lips met, the kiss held no hesitation. It carried the weight of survival, of choice of 2 broken souls, deciding to belong, to fight, to live, to heal together. His arms wrapped around her, and in that silent promise he swore she'd never face the cold alone again. Days later, the snow still lay deep around the cabin. Bullet holes were patched with rough timber, broken shutters nailed back in place. But inside, something fundamental had changed. Where once there had been emptiness, there was now warmth. 2 hearts, 1 fire, and the wild wind of Wyoming whispering outside like a promise they'd earned in blood. The stove burned hotter now. Meals were shared between 2 instead of 1, and the silence that once haunted the cabin had turned into something softer, full of meaning, not emptiness. Every morning, Eli Granger rose with purpose that went beyond his own survival. He cut wood, tended the horses, and kept the fire strong, not just for himself, but for Asha Redfeather. And Asha, once a hunted soul, with nowhere to belong, now moved with quiet strength. There was steadiness in her steps, a peace that came from knowing she finally had a place and someone to call home. By the time spring thawed, the snow, anyone passing through that lonely stretch of land would see only the faint smoke curling from a cabin chimney. A man working by the corral, a woman gathering water from the stream. To strangers, it looked like nothing more than survival. But inside those 4 wooden walls, it was far more than that. They had chosen each other, and in that choice found what the frontier had stolen from them both, belonging. It wasn't just life. It was family. The story didn't end with doubt or distance, but with quiet certainty. Through every storm and every hard winter that followed, Eli Granger and Asha Redfeather would stand side by side, 2 souls, once broken by loss, now bound by the warmth of a fire that would never again burn for one.